everybody to the Wednesday class that shall not be named. We had a break for a couple reasons for 2 or 3 weeks, but now we are back and better than ever. We'll start in a few minutes. We have a small crowd here today, but they're amazing. So we're going to welcome, of course, David, and starting our London branch of Mikveh Israel. We've got Ron and Arlene and maybe Flossie on Haze Mode. Michael and Eva and maybe Paul. We'll probably have and Arnold is on here as well. So welcome to everybody. We hope you are doing well, ready for the high holidays. David was just going over a little of the UK's feeling on Prince Harry, right?
Yes.
And so that was what we really wanted to talk about, so we're done. So I don't know if Flossie's here.
I am. Hello there.
Hey, Flossie, we can't see because it's Haze Mode. Ron is on. I can see Arlene and Ron and maybe you. So
what mode am I on?
You're on, I think it's called Haze Mode maybe, where you can only see the people in the line, but you can't see anything else. Like I can see you, Arlene, and everything else is hazy. Flossie is not in the direct view.
How do I get out of that?
You go to where it says video on the bottom. And then you go choose video, actually where it says blur my background, just click on that. That'll probably unblur you. Or you may be on a video filter. Oh, I think he cut himself off. Oops, sorry about that, Ron. There we go. But it's still fine. We can see you. We can see Arlene. And if Flossie comes into the camera, we can see her.
I don't want to sit on Arlene's lap.
Blur my
sit on Arlene's lap. That's right. There we go. There we go. Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what we're going to do today, we were doing high holiday stuff, but by special request, Flossie had some questions about Jewish athletes. So we'll talk a little bit about Jewish athletes. And no, it is not a 30-second discussion and we're finished. When we talk about Jewish athletes, we're talking, of course, prominent Jewish athletes, some professional, some amateur. But we'll talk a little bit about Jews and athletics. And obviously, there's not as many as in other cultures because we're a very small number. And that's one. Two, at certain times, there were certain fields that were restricted in some ways for Jews. But again, it has to do a lot with we're just a small group of people. So when we talk about Jewish athletes, probably you want to start with the greatest, obviously. However, again, the greatest is often dependent on the age. You may have been great at this period, but you're not considered as great today. You also want to take into account which sporting areas are really popular. And if you can be successful in one of the more prominent sporting area, you're probably doing better. Like today, the most prominent sporting, the athletics in America is obviously, and football would be probably number one. Then you would have maybe basketball and baseball, second and third, or however. But in previous ages, baseball was certainly number one, and football was barely even a blip on the screen, basketball even less so. If we went back 100 years, boxing may have been number one, and baseball was just starting to come into its own. It's pre-Babe, Babe Ruth is just coming on the scene. It's just so, it depends a lot. So if you want to go over the most important Jewish athletes of all time, it's probably good to start in the major sports first. And if you want to talk about the major sports in the past, then you got to talk about what were the most important sports 100 years ago, really when sports started to be a big deal. And so if we go back, we're talking mostly first about baseball and boxing. Those would be the two most important sports of the age. So in that case, Jews do incredibly well if you look at boxing. If you look at baseball, we've had some really good players and we've had some mediocre players, but we've had Major League Baseball players. But it hasn't been to the level of boxing. So we're going to talk about boxing first. Any questions or thoughts before we go? All right. So why was boxing, we've talked about this before, why was boxing such a important sport for the Jewish world? Number one, it's the turn of the 20th century. All right, so it's, you're going from the 19th century to the 20th century. Sports are not as big as they are today. The Jewish community is made up of people who are moving to America. Eastern European immigrants by 1930-ish are going to be 90-something% of all Jews in America. 90, maybe even higher. So you have to take into account that education, although a priority, was still something new that we were taking advantage of. And there was still a lot of restrictions for American Jews in a lot of fields. So we gravitated toward fields that there were very few restrictions. Newer fields like we've talked about Hollywood, and fields that people did not consider high class. And boxing was not high class at all. Nobody cared to restrict a Jewish person from going in a ring and beating up somebody else or getting beat up. It just wasn't done. In fact, it was marketed Jewish boxers versus Italian boxers versus Irish boxers. They would market it this way, that Jews would be fighting the Irish. And plus in New York, you had all these neighborhoods that were Irish and Italian and Jewish, and they were always fighting each other. So it was really completely open. If you wanted to be a professional pugilist, except for maybe the heavyweight division, which we had one Jewish person, but there were some limits there after Jack Johnson, who was the first African American to be the heavyweight champion. So there was some restriction, but anything else, no restrictions at all. And they didn't care if Jews were champions or not. There was the nefarious gambling going on and people throwing, fights. We know that all happened. But there was a lot of Jewish champions and a lot of Jewish boxers who didn't quite become champion, but were at that championship level. So we're going to talk about a few of the greatest boxers first. We'll start off with Max Baer, maybe the most famous today because there was a very prominent movie called The Cinderella Man. Anybody see it with Russell Crowe? Yep. Russell Crowe played James J. Braddock, who was a boxer who had a lot of issues and unretired, came back and won the heavyweight championship of the world, defeating an unbeatable foe. Well, the unbeatable foe was a Jewish guy named Max Baer. And if you recognize the last name, his son became very famous because he played Jethro on the Beverly Hillbillies. So Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies, his father was the heavyweight champion. I think 1937 he lost. So a big brute who didn't have as many skills as some of the others, but was so strong, kind of like a George Foreman in George Foreman's heyday before he lost to Muhammad Ali. And he became the heavyweight champion of the world. He wore a Jewish star on his trunks. Remember, this is the 1930s, which was the heyday for anti-Semitism and for Nazi support in America. This is before the beginning of World War II. And Max Baer was a very intimidating boxer, so much so that James J. Braddock had become a very popular people's champion. He overcame odds. He was older. He wasn't supposed to be a champion. He became very popular, kind of like Seabiscuit. He was like America's champion. So the boxing leaders went up to him and asked him not to try and be heavyweight champion of the world because they didn't want him to get killed by Max Baer. They thought it was going to be a decimation and it would be hurt boxing's reputation, hurt ratings, and that kind of thing, and hurt its popularity. That's how vicious Max Baer was. So of course Max Baer loses. He fights a few more, doesn't have much of a career. Back then, if you lost the heavyweight championship, you didn't win it back. It almost never happened. It had never happened before. And of course, Max Baer and James J. Braddock will fade into the background because James J. Braddock is going to lose to somebody named Joe Louis, who will be, of course, the most famous heavyweight probably until Muhammad Ali. So Max Baer has kind of been forgotten, but to be heavyweight champion in 1930s was a big deal. It's not like today where there's 27 different heavyweight champions and they're competing and losing to mixed martial arts. The heavyweight champion of the world was maybe the most prominent sports figure in the world, especially once Babe Ruth retired. I mean, he was it, and that was a Jewish guy. And there was some anti-Semitism, but he didn't care. And again, pretty impressive that a Jewish person was allowed to become heavyweight champion. So he would be the most famous because he was heavyweight champion. He is no way the best boxer, Jewish boxer of all time. That is a guy probably named Benny Leonard, who was the lightweight champion and is considered one of the best lightweight champions of all time. Max Baer is not considered one of the greatest heavyweight champions of all time, but Benny Leonard, fought over 200 fights and was a champion for a very long time. Lost money in the crash, came back, and was a very good boxer again. But we're talking in 1920s, one of the greatest boxers of all time. So if you go and look at the list of the best lightweights of all time, he will be in the top 10. The second best is a gentleman who fought about the same time, but just a little later, named a guy named Barney Ross, who was one of the first champions to be, I think he was the first person to be a champion in 3 divisions. And he was a little guy also. He fought welterweight and under. And he was probably the last great, him and Max Baer, the last great boxers who were Jewish. Now, there have been boxers since, but I think we all know why there haven't been as many famous Jewish boxers is because you get hit in the face a lot, right? And if you're the champion, you may make money, but there's a lot of grift involved, and you can make money doing other things where you don't get hit in the face and die really young and end up with Parkinson's, God forbid. So what we see is by the 1930s, Jews are really centering themselves on education even more. And this fighting for your self-respect in New York is kind of fading. And so him and Max Baer may have been the last champions who were Jewish, but there was a lot of other ones. A guy, and they had some great nicknames. Ted Kid Lewis, who was a welterweight champion. Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, who was a light heavyweight champion. He got the nickname because instead of going like this, he would go like this with his gloves. And he had some really big victories. He actually beat James J. Braddock before he was heavyweight champion. Battling Levinsky, who may have been the Jewish person with the most fights. He fought 275 fights. That's a lot of fights. If you didn't know, today, if you fight 30 or 40 in your career, that's a lot. So 275 fights is a lot. Daniel Mendoza, who is the most famous boxer from the 17th century in England. If you look up famous boxers before the 19th century, he's the only one anybody's ever heard about. This is during the bare knuckle phases, and he was a very famous boxer from his day. Jack Kidberg, another kid. Jackie Fields, featherweight champion. Louis Kid Kaplan. There are 3 Kid who are nicknamed for Jewish people. Phil Rosenberg, the champion at the lowest weight. And finally, probably my favorite champion of all time was a guy named Abe Attell. Now, why is he so famous? Abe Attell was the featherweight champion in the early 1900s. One of these guys who admitted he lost a lot of fights on purpose. Why did he lose fights on purpose? Because he was the odds favorite and he would bet on the other guy along with the mafia that he was connected with and make a lot more money. But he became more famous for something else. I think many people have heard of the Black Sox scandal, when in 1917 the White Sox threw the World Series to the Cincinnati Reds.
Yeah.
A Jewish man became very famous, Arnold Rothstein, because he's the guy who did it. He's the guy who paid him. Actually, he didn't pay any of them, really. He was supposed to pay them. There's a whole story behind it. The owner of the White Sox, Kaminsky, would not spend a penny, and he underpaid his players. And back then you were trapped, so his players were making so much more money on the off season. He wouldn't pay them, and famously, he had one player that he had in his contract, if he won 30 games, which was very rare, he would get this huge bonus. So he got to his 29th win, and the owner wouldn't let him pitch anymore for the rest of the season.
Whoa.
So why is Abe Attell, who's a boxer, so connected? Well, he is the middleman. He is the guy who was working with Rothstein and meeting with the players to pay them off to throw the World Series. That's where Abe Attell became more famous, not only for his boxing, but because he was the middleman in the fixing of the 1917 World Series. So again, if you're going to pick one sport that Jews have done better at than any other sport professionally, it's not even close. It is boxing. We're talking 20, 30 champions, but 10 times that many who were capable boxers. Very few in recent years, but boxing now, it's even more important to us when we remember that 100 years ago, boxing was the #1 sport in America. And into the 1930s, it was #2 after baseball. So it was a big deal to be in boxing. That's where all the crowds went. Football, NFL football hadn't even started till college football was kind of big, but not as big as boxing. So kudos to all those Jewish champions. You can just go online. Again, the greatest would be Benner Leonard, then Barney Ross, and then you'd have the 3 kids, Kid Berg, Kid Lewis, Slapsy, Maxie Rosenberg. My favorite nickname is probably Battling Levinsky. I think that just Joe Chrysanthemum, or Chrysanthemum Joe, who was Joe Hoinski, who was never a champion, but he almost won the heavyweight champion. He almost beat Jim Jeffries, who was considered the greatest champion of all time. So let's go to, now that we've done boxing.
What was the person's name? Battling
Levinsky. He was a light heavyweight champion. He was a bigger guy. But remember back then, you're dealing with the mob, and sometimes the mob just didn't want you to be champion. So if Joe Hoinski had beaten Jim Jeffries, he would shoot up to #1, because Jim Jeffries was the greatest boxer of all time until some other ones like Joe Louis became more famous than him. So let's go to another famous sport.
Rosenblum.
Yeah, and you can go online, and there's a lot. Now, the best thing about them is a lot of them had fake names when they fought because they didn't want their mothers to know they were fighting, because they'd have all over the cities, they'd have those
Billboards.
the boards, and they'd paste them all over the place who was fighting. So even if you weren't a boxing fan, you would still see them everywhere. So they had to hide their names, because if not, they know their mom would have beaten them up. So, but let's go to a sport that, of course, would become America's sport for a long time, and that would be baseball, which would supplant boxing and be America's sport, probably number one sport from the 20s until the 70s. So probably 50 years or more, the number one sport in America, until the NFL really takes over. And we've had a lot of good baseball players through the year. There have been some, and I don't keep up with baseball anymore, so there's several recently I'm not as familiar with. But some great baseball players. Have you ever heard the phrase "tinkers to Evers to chance"? It became a very big poem song. Well, that's the second baseman, third baseman, first baseman for the Chicago Cubs. Johnny Kling was the catcher for the great Cubs teams of the early 1900s before they never won again. So he was the catcher when they won their last World Series, before they won one recently. So that was like 1908. So Johnny Kling, obviously. You have others like Ryan Braun, who was a really good player in the modern world, probably just below going into the Hall of Fame. Same with Shawn Green, who played for most famously LA, but Toronto, and he was a great player. Ken Holtzman, who was again just below Hall of Fame level. He was a pitcher in the 1970s for the Cubs, and won 3 World Series in a row with the A's, and again was an all-star and had a lot of wins. So there's been a lot of baseball players through the years, but obviously there's only 2 baseball players. There's Hall of Famers who were managers and broadcasters, but there's only 2 baseball players who are in the Hall of Fame. Another one who came close was Al Rosen, who was basically probably 0.001 points away from being in the Hall of Fame. There's something called the Triple Crown, where you lead in the league in home runs, batting average, and RBIs, which rarely happens. It's happened once this century, and had happened, once since twice since the 1940s. And he was 0.001 percentage points away from winning the Triple Crown. He was an all-star third baseman for the Indians, would have been a Hall of Famer, but he had a terrible injury, and they became a really famous executive in baseball. But he didn't make it in the Hall of Fame for his. So who are the 2 baseball Hall of Famers? If you're going to pick out a list of greatest sports legends, these are the top 2, probably because they played the most prominent sport and were the best players. The best Jewish baseball player of all time is probably not Sandy Koufax. It is probably Hank Greenberg. If you don't know who Hank Greenberg is, played for the Detroit Tigers in the 1930s. After Babe Ruth retired, he became the best player in baseball for a few years. Completely dominant. How dominant was he? Babe Ruth had a record for most home runs in a season, which was considered the most important record in all of sports. Hank Greenberg got really close. The record was 60. Hank Greenberg got to 58. Why didn't he break the record? Because for the rest of the season, every team was ordered by the commissioner of baseball to walk him. So he walked every single time or got pitches so out of the strike zone, just so that so a Jewish person wouldn't break the most hallowed record of all time. So he was the greatest player in the mid to late 30s, dominating And why isn't he more famous? Because
World War II.
World War II is right the day after the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. He became the first Major League Baseball player to sign up for the draft and go into the military. And he spent 5 full years of his prime. So his best 5 years were in the military. So he was the most dominant player for the 5 years before he went into military, and probably the most dominant player for the 2 years afterwards, but of course age caught up with him. So he still is in the Hall of Fame. He was, I believe, inducted in his first year he was inducted really early. He would have probably been the third best player of all time after Babe Ruth and a guy named Ted Williams if he had not spent 5 years in the military. To be fair, Ted Williams spent also 5 years in the military as well, but he was very young. He was about 5 or 6, 7 years younger, so he had a few more years after the military. So Hank Greenberg also played in the 1930s in Detroit, where it was a much more difficult place to play because he was Jewish and any issues might affect the rest of the Detroit community. They were very fearful that if he didn't play in the World Series, that there would be mass riots against the Jewish community in Detroit. And so he had to seek guidance from rabbis and community leaders to make sure. But it was, again, was considered obviously not only one of the best players, but one of the most respected players of all time. And so if you want to look at probably the most important Jewish athlete, it would be Hank Greenberg in many respects. He's playing at a time where heightened anti-Semitism is there. We're coming through, finishing off the Depression. The Nazi Party is becoming very popular in America. It's before World War II. Now, others would argue that Sandy Koufax is the best baseball player of all time, which could be true. How many of you have heard of Sandy Koufax? So he was a mediocre player with he threw the ball faster than anybody else, but he couldn't control it. So he was scaring people to death that he was going to hit them. And so this was his career. He was a decent pitcher who could throw the very fast. And then what happened was he figured it out. He figured it out for various reasons, pitching for the Los Angeles Dodgers. And for 5 years, he was unhittable. He was basically 5 years, he dominated like nobody's ever dominated before. But then at 32, he had an elbow injury and he had to retire. It was an arm injury. Now today, if he'd had that injury, what would they do? They would fix it.
They'd done surgery.
Yeah, and he would be fine. But back then, not the case. They told him, if you keep pitching, you're going to lose use of your arm. And so he had to retire very young. So his career numbers are not that great compared to all the Hall of Famers, except if you look at that 5-year period where he was completely dominant, like nobody's ever been dominant before. So most famously, obviously, he sat out the World Series. So we've talked about this before, which led to probably my all-time favorite Jewish sports quote, which I've said many times. Don Drysdale took his place on the mound. Don Drysdale was a Hall of Fame pitcher as well. Maybe overall had a better career, although Koufax was more dominant. And so he got destroyed in the first inning of the game. And when his manager, Walter Alston, came to take him out of the game, he said to the manager, I bet right now you wish I was Jewish too. And that was a legendary comment from him. So to this day, there are still Major League Baseball players. There have been several who have been very good. And there have been several who have been great, but only 2 who have been Hall of Fame great. as of now, but that may change in the future. I think there's one or two really good players today I don't keep up anymore who are Jewish. But there's been some really good Jewish managers and broadcasters, umpires as well. So those are the athletes who were the best, Jewish athletes who were the best in their sport when their sport was the most important sports. So you have to really put them a level above. Sandy Koufax, Hank Greenberg, Benny Leonard, Barney Ross, those are the guys you probably have to put at the top. Michael.
Yeah, it wasn't a great player, but Mo Berg.
Right. Oh, we'll go over that in a second. Yes, that's a great one.
Okay. And I mean, in a sense, he was
right. We'll talk about Mo Berg.
An island by himself.
Mo
literally,
Berg,
figuratively.
Yeah, and it's a great story. It's sometimes so Mo Berg was a really mediocre to not very good major league catcher.
That's right.
I played with a bunch of teams, the White Sox, the Indians, the Senators. He played with the Red Sox, which was very, one of another great quote, because he was a terrible player and he's playing for the Red Sox, and the Red Sox have the best player in baseball, a guy named Ted Williams. And Mo Berg goes up and hits a home run, one of the only times he ever hit a home run. And he comes up to Ted Williams and said, "See, that's how you do it, Teddy." Said something like that to the best player of all time after Babe Ruth. So he was a very smart man, spoke a lot of languages, but I love baseball. He was considered the strangest man to ever play baseball, because back then, baseball players did not go to college and certainly didn't go to Princeton and Columbia Law School. And he was really a strange, interesting guy. And so what became very famous for him was when America sent baseball players to Japan to play against the Japanese in the late 1930s. They sent players like Babe Ruth, who was, older and retired, or Ted Williams, or Joe DiMaggio. And they also sent Mo Berg. Why would they send Mo Berg with these Hall of Famers? It's because the U.S. knew they were going to go to war with Japan eventually, so they sent Mo Berg with cameras, and he would go to the tallest buildings and take pictures of all of Japan that they would use later in World War II. Now, after the war, and during the war, he's probably doing some undercover work. He helped bring scientists after the war to America, when we're trying to vie with the Soviet Union for the best scientists. So he was doing all of this work undercover. Now, sometimes it gets exaggerated, but he did do a lot for the help. But again, once his spying days were over, he did some spying during the war, worked for the Office of Strategic Services, the whole 9 yards. But, after the war, he tried and do some more stuff. He wanted to do more stuff with the CIA, but he was kind of like a strange guy. He basically ended up living in the basement of his brother's house for the rest of his life because he didn't really know how. So, but he did some really interesting, strange things throughout his life, and he even got some Hall of Fame votes, which was, pretty funny, because obviously he was not a great player, but he was moody, he was strange, he didn't like socializing, he liked reading books, he loved baseball. So he is one of the stranger, more interesting players of all time. And there's probably, I think, a documentary about him that really, and his final words were most famously, "How did the Mets do today?" Because he absolutely loved baseball. He actually, I think, also for a while tried to work with the Three Stooges. They were Jewish, obviously, as well. So those are the greatest greatest athletes in the most important sports. Now, obviously, if you reach outside the most important sports, you're going to begin with Mark Spitz, who won 7 gold medals in 1 Olympics and 9 gold medals overall, which was the record until the record was obviously obliterated by, what's his name? Michael Phelps. So he had the record of 9 gold medals. I think Phelps has like 20 something gold medals. So, but he was considered the greatest Jewish athlete because of how good he was dominating the Olympics. Nobody had ever won 7 gold medals in Olympics or even close. So he obviously was, and again, it's so funny because he was considered a failure before that because he was supposed to do really well in the 1968 Olympics. He won 2 gold medals in relays, but really choked. But in the 1972 Olympics, he really dominated. So he would be, but also Dara Torres, who is a much more recent Olympian. And she is famous because she went to 5 Olympics, not counting the one she skipped. So she went to 5 Olympics, and even though she wasn't as dominant, she won 12 medals, which is a lot. But, you know, going to 5 Olympics is pretty amazing. Probably the most incredible star athlete would be Agnes Coletti in gymnastics, who I think we talked about her when we talked about Jewish women, because really a story that is beyond incredible in what she did, because not only, it's not that she won the Olympics, it's what her story was. And her story is really quite unlike any other story because of her life. So she was a great athlete at the wrong time, because where was she living? She's living, of course, in Europe. She is in Europe at the wrong time to be an Olympic. She's living in Budapest. She's born and raised in Budapest. 1939, she's the best gymnast in the world at 18. And so, as we can imagine, her life took a big turn because of the World War II and because of the Nazis. Now, even before World War II, there were a lot of issues with her, because even though the Nazis hadn't taken over yet, the idea of them had really gone further. So she is Hungarian, the best gymnast in the world, and is supposed to go to the 1940 Olympics. But of course, it doesn't happen because there are no 1940 Olympics because the war started. And so once the war started, again, that is a real problem for all the Jews there. So she got fake identification papers. And she, before that, was working carrying dead bodies to the graves. As you know, she is someone who is the story of fortitude. So she wins. She's the best gymnast. Hungary's invaded. She pretends to be a Christian girl, buying papers. She works as an ammunition factory. She's moving dead bodies to mass graves, all pretending not to be Jewish. Goes into hiding and is saved by Wallenberg himself. With her mother, her father was killed. And so, of course, her gymnastics career is over because gymnastics is a sport for young girls. I mean, your peak is 16, 17, 18, 19. So after the war, you know, it's way too late to be a gymnast, you would think, because she's already in her mid to late 20s. But she does go back to gymnastics and is ready to compete in the 1948 Olympics at 27, which is very old. Even today, that's old. And she gets injured. And she can't participate in the 48 Olympics. So what does she do? She participates in the 1952 and 56 Olympics and wins gold medals. 4 gold medals in 1952 at the age of 31, which was not, I mean, just think about Mary Lou Retton was, I think, 15, and all the girls, all the great Olympians, until really recently with modern technology, have some older ones, but not 31. But then she goes and wins the World Championships in 1954, and then she goes and at 35 wins 4 gold medals in the 1956 Olympics and wins other medals as well. And then while there, because she, you know, she's in Hungary, which is part of the Soviet Union, while at the 56 Olympics in Australia, she defects with a lot of others, and she does a lot of work in various areas, including gymnastics, moves to Israel for a while, and works with the Israeli gymnastics team. So a woman who really is incredible. Not only that, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think she is the oldest ever Olympic champion in terms of when she dies. So she died at 103, I think.
Wow.
The oldest woman, oldest person who ever lived to win an Olympic gold medal. She's the oldest woman ever to win an Olympic gold medal in gymnastics, which is really a really strange thing. So again, if you go online, there's plenty about her and about her life. Again, it's one of these terrible things living in Hungary with a modern Jewish family, not realizing what is coming, and gets, of course, caught up in World War II and survives the Holocaust, and really, and then lives 103. Lives in, she goes back and lives in Hungary parts, and Australia, and Israel. So maybe the most impressive Jewish athlete of all time. Again, a lot of what ifs, but again, the what ifs are big. If there hadn't been a World War II, that's a big what if. You know, you could say the same for Hank Greenberg and every other athlete. Other gymnasts, there was a woman named, and I can never pronounce her name, Maria Gorakovskaya, who also was a gymnast who won gold medals alongside in the 52 Olympics. I think yeah. So was she a gymnast? Maybe not. I don't think she was a gymnast. I just forgot who she was. She was, yeah, I think a gymnast. Yeah. So there's some others like that. Lenny Kratzenberg, a swimmer, won a bunch of medals in 2000. So you've got other athletes that are very famous, like John Lezak, who won gold medals in swimming. Dick Savitt, who was the only Jewish tennis player to win a major. He won Wimbledon when it was still as an amateur. So you've got other great players. But if you want to go to major sports, the other major sports would be football and basketball, where Jews have obviously dominated for generations. Now, there's been a lot of basketball coaches, but very few basketball players. So Tal Brody, who was an American but moved to Israel, became a very prominent basketball player. He helped Israel win the European Championships, which was a big deal. And so was a great player for Tel Aviv, Maccabi Tel Aviv. But if you're going to talk about basketball, you got only one. There's one great Jewish basketball player who is like a first round Hall of Famer. His name was Dolph Schayes. I don't know if anybody heard Dolph Schayes. I think you can all understand why he was called Dolph. Because
his name was Adolf.
So Adolf was actually a very popular Jewish name, and then of course, for some reason we know, stopped being a popular Jewish name, so Adolf became Dolph. So he is one of the greatest basketball players of all time. But of course, he played in the 1950s, where basketball was not as popular as today. And obviously the players weren't as capable today. But if you were going to go to the 1950s and pick the best players through 1960, he would be one of the 2 or 3 best with George Mikan, and he was one of the most dominant players. 12 times he went to the All-Star game. He led the Syracuse Nationals, which became the Philadelphia 76ers, to the NBA title. So a dominant 16-year career where he was consistently one of the best. They call the position forward. Now, his father was a truck driver. They were Jewish immigrants from the Eastern Europe, as we all know. Basketball, when he was growing up, was not a major sport, but he was 6'8". His son played for a short time too, Danny Shave. But he played for NYU, and then he would later coach there as well, and led them to unprecedented heights, to the NCAA, to the college championship game, and then became one of the early, the NBA only started in the late 1940s. He was right there when the NBA started. And he would be as what they call it all NBA, which means you're one of the 5 best players. He did that 6 times. And then 6 times he was the second team, one of the 12 best players, but really one of the great players of all time. He could do almost anything on the court. He was good at shooting, good at rebounding. He was a player coach later. No, sorry, he didn't coach at NYU. That was a different player. But most famously, what he did was during the NBA championships, he led them to the title, which is impressive. But why is it more impressive? Maybe the most impressive basketball feat of all time. You say, well, Michael Jordan, we've all heard of him, and LeBron James. What did Dolph Schayes do that neither one of those guys could have done? He played and led his team to the NBA championship when he had both arms were broken.
Oh my God.
2 broken arms, and he led them to the championships. So that's how tough he was. I think he became a referee as well. So again, that was his legacy, was leading to the championship. Because obviously, when you get to players like Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, and then later Michael Jordan, they're much better players. But at this point in time, he would have probably considered the second best player of his age after another guy. So that's how good he was. Now, that's for NBA players. Now, it wasn't a major sport back then, as it would become, but let's talk about basketball in its infancy. So when basketball first started, by James Naismith and, 100 years ago, it was not a big deal. But then you started having leagues and you'd have travel teams. And one of those travel teams was a team called the New York Original Celtics. Obviously, that name would be taken by Boston. And this was a team that would barnstorm around the country. And almost all of the players were Jewish. The most famous was a guy named Nat Holman, who would be the guy who coached CCNY and later NYU. So all of these players, Joe Lapchick, Johnny Beckman, Pete Barry, I think, was Jewish as well. So most of them were Jewish, financed by a Jewish guy who would be one of the main guys who started the NBA, Eddie Gottlieb. And they would travel around, playing basketball games, kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters, but without the comedy. The problem was that they just didn't lose. Ever. They won so often that people didn't want to play them anymore. How often? At one point, they won about 193 games out of 200.
Oh my gosh.
So they lost 5 or 6 games. They lost, and a lot of that may have been they need to lose once in a while to give people hope. But teams would just stop playing them. So they eventually had to disband. But before they disbanded, they won all the championships of the day. These. Later, another team would reflect what they did. A Jewish guy would get 5 African Americans and start playing, and they would be also unbeatable and nobody would want to play them. So what did they do instead of disbanding? What did they do instead? They started joking around. And the Harlem Globetrotters went from being a dominant actual team to a traveling comedy show, which is still around to this day. So that was founded by a Jewish guy. So there were great Jewish players. In the 1930s, the first person who said, I can jump and shoot at the same time, which sounds ridiculous to us, but back then you had to stand, pause, and then shoot.
Wow.
You couldn't jump and shoot. And he was the first guy who said, wait a minute, why don't I just jump and shoot? And that was a Jewish guy in the 1930s. So now when it comes to boxing, we have a lot, but again, the other major sport would be football. And as you can imagine, not that many great Jewish football players. There have been a couple. Benny Friedman was a great player in the early NFL, was one of the best players the first couple of years in the Hall of Fame. He played for Michigan. Remember, college football back then was much bigger. He played college football. And Ron Mix was a very good player in the 1960s with the AFL. He's a member of the Jewish Hall of Fame and not the regular Hall of Fame. So there have been players. There was an offensive lineman for Niners, Marshall Goldberg, led Pittsburgh to back-to-back national championships and played and was a good player in NFL. But if you're going to look at football players, there's one truly great Jewish football player. And it's really, in some ways, a sad state for the Chicago Bears. Because in the history of the Chicago Bears, one of the original football NFL teams, the only Hall of Fame quarterback, the only really good quarterback the Chicago Bears ever had was a guy who wore a leather helmet.
Oh my goodness.
That tells you how bad their quarterbacks have been. They have never had a good quarterback. They've had mediocre ones, but only one good one, and that was a guy named Sid Luckman. Now, Sid Luckman would be considered one of the best quarterbacks of all time. Now, again, remember, this is the 1930s and maybe early 40s. So it's not the same football today with Tom Brady. You know, it's not the most important game in the world for Americans. So but at his time period, he would be considered one of the two best players for his whole time period. And again, born to Jewish immigrants who all came over at the same time. He went to Columbia because football players went to college because college football was so much more important. Played at Columbia, which was a very good place to play. And then in the 40s, it started in the 40s, went to the NFL. And he was also in ZBT, by the way.
Yeah.
So, you know, in college, to pay for college, he was a babysitter. But again, a great player in college, one of the best college players. He was selected early in the draft, I believe, if there was a draft even, and became a great quarterback leading the Chicago Bears to the championship and really being one of the most dominant players of his time period. And he played for a good 10 years. So we're talking about most of the 40s.
Rabbi,
Yes.
what's this Jewish Hall of Fame you're talking about?
There is a Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. It's headquartered in Tel Aviv.
Oh, in Tel Aviv. Is it all sports or just one?
It's all sports.
Thank you.
So now, most famously, Sid Luckman in 1940 played with the other great quarterback of the age, a guy named Sammy Baugh, considered better than Sid Luckman. So the Chicago Bears played the Washington Redskins in the championship in 1940. And the Redskins were the heavy favorite. They had Sammy Baugh, who was the best quarterback. Sid Luckman would have been the second best. And it was a very famous game because Sid Luckman's Bears beat the Redskins 73-0.
What?
The most famous, you know, this was supposed to be a competitive game, and they destroyed them 73-0. And that was probably, and they went undefeated that year. So that was the highest moment in his career, one of the greatest moments in the history of the NFL. It was also famous because Sammy Baugh for the Redskins had thrown and somebody had dropped a touchdown pass early in the game that would have put them ahead. And they asked Sammy Baugh after the game, if your player had caught that touchdown, would that have changed the game? And Sammy Baugh says, oh yes, the whole game would have been changed. The score would have been 73-7. So that was like one of those funny. So Sid Luckman, obviously, and also served in the Marines, or the Merchant Marines during World War II, so he missed some time there, but really considered one of the great players of all time, even though he missed some time for the years. And then he became an executive with the Bears afterwards, and then became a business person afterwards as well. So that would be, so we'll finish with Sid Luckman. So again, if you're going to rank players, I like to rank players who were at the top of the most important sport when that sport was the most important sport. Sid Luckman is one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, but he played at a time when the NFL was not as big a deal. Whereas Sandy Koufax and Hank Greenberg played baseball when baseball was big, and the Barney Ross and Benny Leonard and Abe Patel and Kid Lewis and Slapsy Max and Rosenbaum, they all were the top boxers when boxing was a big sport. So there's been a lot of Jewish athletes. Again, we're a very small percentage, and since a lot of us stressed education so much, and in previous years, sports were not really a place for the educated. A lot of difference than today. There's not as many, but again, we could go over sports coaches and legends and all that, and there's been a lot. So let's take a moment to go over what's coming up. High holidays coming up soon. So this Saturday night, of course, is Slichot. We have a dinner, a musical program, and then the service. Everybody is welcome. And then shortly after that, a week from Tuesday, will be Rosh Hashanah evening. So you don't need to make reservations for anything unless you want dinner, but we've got, first day Rosh Hashanah, second day Rosh Hashanah, and programs all day for Yom Kippur. For Sukkot, what we do now is have a big major Sukkot party in the middle of Sukkot on that Friday. So that will be something that will stress, we call it Sukkah Palooza. The Cantor brought it. It was a really big success last year. So that'll be after Yom Kippur. So Rosh Hashanah is on the 22nd. Yom Kippur starts on the 1st. And Sukkah Palooza will be on the 10th. So those are our main ones. But there's a lot. You should have gotten all the information. If you're not a member and you want information, please just let us know and we'll send it to you. But so much going on. Looking forward to the high holidays. Hope everybody's well. Got a little lesson in Jewish sports history.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
There's been, and we can go over more. There's some tennis players like Eddie Dibbs, you may remember, or Harold Solomon. They called them the Bagel Brothers.
Bagel burger.
Yes, in the 70s and 80s. And so there's a couple of good tennis players. There was a tennis player from Chile, Nicholas Massou, who won the Olympic gold medal in tennis, which was a big deal. And so there's been some good players. All right, guys, all my best. Looking
Thank you,
forward to seeing. We
Rabbi.
will be having class
Thank you.
next week. Have a wonderful preparatory period for the holidays. And if you need anything, let us know.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Stay safe, everybody.
Take care,
And
be
so,
well.
from us to everybody, we'll put you on Gallery View. Thank you to David and Michael and Eva and Arlene and Flossie and Ron
Thank
and
you, Rabbi.
Lou and Arnold
Thank you very much.
and everybody else who's watching on YouTube. And we will see you next week on the Wednesday class that shall not be named.